Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Sally Haldorson, Managing Director of Porchlight Book Company. Porchlight is a local and family-owned business in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with a book-selling heritage of nearly 100 years. Our company believes that books bring people and ideas together. In addition to curating book recommendations, we customize book sales and services for organizations of any size and ship books directly to employees or clients or in bulk to groups or events. While I normally wax poetic when introducing our guests, and that will come, and as I talk about the book that we're about to be in conversation with, I'm just going to start by putting this plainly. This book is terrific. It will positively influence your relationship to work and how well your work fits into the rest of your life, either immediately or regarding future decisions, whether you are trying to make a decision about your career path or being called to make a change away from your current position, if you love your job or the things it buys a little too much but are experiencing burnout, if you're doing a job and are worried whether you should love it, this book is for you. While at times a personally and philosophically heavy subject, because time at work is valuable time we spend between birth and death, the content is accessible and well-balanced with personal stories, historic figures, literary references, light humor, and a sprinkling of pop culture. The passion that the authors have for the material, for the value of questioning, is your work worth it, jumps off the page. Authors Christopher Wong Michaelson and Jennifer Tosti-Kharas offer us, as the subtitle indicates, a way to think about meaningful work that empowers us to be intentional about the decisions we make around and about the role work plays in our lives. Otherwise, we might find that we've traded our time for money in a way that the value of that time has not been worth the money. If you are eager to find fulfilling work or to find fulfillment in your work, this book is written for you. Welcome to Christopher and Jen. Thank you for joining us.
Wow, what an amazing introduction, Sally. I'm happy to let you just keep talking about the book. And so grateful to be here as somebody who thinks that bringing books to people is worthy work.
That's, I couldn't help but apply a lot of this book to my experience here. I've been lucky enough to work in books, to study books, work in books for a lifetime, really. And you dig into that in the book when we talk about purpose and a calling, and we'll move into that area. But first, in lieu of reading your CVs or your bios off the book jacket, could you two share how your early career and life experiences led you to the jobs you do now, which then led you to writing this book?
Well, I'm a philosopher, and I wanted to study the meaning of life. But not even Socrates could find paid work studying the meaning of life. And so naturally, I went into management consulting in New York City. And when I was doing that, that's when the 9/11 terrorist attacks occurred. And as we tell the story of the book, that's something that led us both to think a lot, not only about the worthiness of our own work, but also especially what made the work of the people who lost their lives in the attacks worth doing.
Yeah, so Christopher and I were lucky enough to meet as academics at a conference on the meaning of work. And I was an organizational psychologist by training. He was, as he said, a philosopher and business ethicist. But we realized we had all these parallels in our past. And one of the big ones was we were both management consultants living and working in New York City during 9/11. And for both of us, like many people, that really catalyzed, what are we doing with our lives, with our precious time on this earth? And, is doing that work really worth it in terms of both the sacrifices we make to do it and what it's giving to the world more broadly? And so shortly thereafter, we both made these, career changes, entered academia, And then the rest, as they say, is history. And so we've been working together on academic research, on a study of the victims of 9/11 and their memory, and what that legacy means in terms of the work that they did and how they're remembered. And then this book was just this, logical extension of the work we had been doing together in a more sort of academic setting.
I think that was one of the things that surprised me in the book when I first started reading it, because I've been reading business books and books about work for 20, 25 years. And what sets this book apart is how grounded it is in the human experience. And the use of 9/11 is so heavy, but the way that you deal with it in terms of how we can benefit from reflecting on the loss of lives at that time to actually sort of drive fulfillment and conjure meaning in our own lives, I think is such a beautiful way to do it. And it really, as I said, grounds the book. If you don't mind, I'd actually like to read a little section here that comes from that story and how you came to really center around 9/11. This is in regards to the obituaries written in the New York Times to honor those who were killed. And I'm just quoting your wonderful writing. They signify not only what makes a given person's life worth living or their work worth doing, but also asks us to think about what ought to make anyone's work worth doing and life worth living. We wanted to understand more about the work of those who were lost that day. We thought that one way we could honor their memories was to learn from their stories as a starting point for answering the question, why work? Not only how we wish to answer it for ourselves, but also what society regards as worthy reasons to work. The lives that were lost arguably represented the diversity of the modern working world. Unlike traditional obituaries that might favor the rich and famous, the portraits celebrated every life lost on equal footing. And there are a couple things there that I would love to highlight. One of them is equal footing and the importance of that phrase. And then another one is that what we don't think about often is that the majority of the people who lost their lives that day were just going about their normal day's work. And they had a whole lifetime of decision-making that led them to be in their office, in their workplace, in the restaurant that day. And then also, of course, as first responders and other people who were affected by it. And I think I would love to just dig in a little bit about sort of not why that's an inspiration, but how that inspired you, why it's important to think of all of those positions on an equal footing, and then how that sort of applies to us here today as we think about this book.
Yeah, we remember those days. And to live in New York at the time where the vast majority of the victims lost their lives was to live in a place of sorrow, but also to live in a place that was very inspiring. It led people to be more humane to each other and to seek to learn more about each other. A couple of months after the attacks, an article came out in the Wall Street Journal, of all places, about how people were leaving high-paying, high-flying jobs for more meaningful work. And that's a phenomenon that we sought to study more, and also tried to explore the question, is that a privilege that's available to some people who have high-paying jobs, or is meaningful work a human right for anybody? And we really owe it to the victims' families and to the reporters of the New York Times who wrote this series of portraits for representing their stories so beautifully and so meaningfully in a way that we could, as scholars, interpret. And so I think, just to put an accent on the equal footing point, we sometimes celebrate the most visible and the most prestigious kinds of work, but these portraits sometimes shone a light on the humble work of somebody delivering food for a restaurant within the towers, or somebody who washed the windows in a very precarious position outside of these very high skyscrapers. And sometimes just highlighted the importance of doing honest work for the sake of supporting a family, sending money back home to build the family dream.
Jen, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think the only thing I would add, because Christopher really did a great job, covering the portraits and what they meant to us. When we study what work means to people, we have these sort of natural biases as academics, as anyone naturally does, right? It's very hard to get very full picture of what work means to people. And so one of the ways we're biased is we do tend to select on not just sort of prestigious and visible occupations, but as someone who studies work as a calling, that's one of my main research areas, we often focus on these sort of prototypical, I'll call them, calling professions. So do-gooders, people who help animals, musicians, artists, clergy people. So people who have very clearly jobs where you would expect to find a lot of meaningfulness and a lot of meaning making. And we don't tend to study, not only do we not tend to sometimes recognize in society the window washers and the clerks and the delivery people, but we don't tend to study them. And the other way that we're biased, and I say this as a psychologist, is that we tend to ask people what their work means. That's how we study it. So it's first person accounts. And we don't look at what work means through the eyes of those who knew the worker best and who are very wrapped up in their work story. So think about, parents children whose parents catch the first train into the city, to get to the World Trade Center early for work that day. Because the people who were killed were there fairly early in the work, not just there in the workday, fairly early in the workday. They're catching the last train home. They're maybe missing bedtimes. Right. So spouses who are making sacrifices, coworkers, bosses. I mean, these are all the perspectives that were, friends, family members that were represented in the portraits of grief. And so we just thought, it's not a substitute, nor is it an accurate representation of how that person actually felt about their work, what they felt their work actually meant to themselves. But it's this really important societal, social, relational, cultural lens on what did that work mean and what legacy did that work leave in the eyes of the people who knew the victim the best. And we thought that's such an important perspective that's almost never actually captured. So we've had some research on this, and then we just wanted to bring that into the book because it really does shine a almost totally different light than on what work means.
It's truly not just original, and I mean that in the context of other conversations about work, but I think when we are talking about meaningful work and is your work worth it, we are also sort of engaging in a better effort to understand the whys of everything, right? And when you have a loss of life, there is an engagement with why, right? And so that leads me to we'll go back up to the surface a bit here and say that leads me to a question on, as you mentioned and write in the book, that this book was written by a psychologist and a philosopher. And I'm interested in if you can share with new readers to the book, how you balanced those two perspectives. And then also, one of the things that I loved about reading the book is your humility, like as you just recognized a number of biases that we all have as humans, and I really enjoyed the joke you joke at one point that no one in a crisis yells out, "Quick, call a philosopher." That's a great line. So when, you even mentioned that you may be considered as in the ivory tower, right? And so we're talking about how your professions influenced what you include in the book, because there's so much here, but also then sort of playing off that idea of how do we get around our own biases? How are we humble about what we do? And why does that lead us to better understand how work works in most people's lives?
Yeah, it's not lost
in that question.
No, I mean, it's not lost on us that I always tell people, we have the best jobs in the world. So, I mean, being academics with a high degree of freedom, autonomy, I mean, we're able to create classes where we're teaching others about the topics that mean the most to us. We get to choose what we study, what we research. We make our own schedules, all those kinds of things. We recognize how unbelievably privileged we are. And I think for both Christopher and myself, so again, we have, plenty of things that are distinct about us, but then a lot of things that are shared. And I think one thing that's really shared among us is coming from more humble origins. So Christopher tells the story beautifully in chapter 1 of his grandfather who emigrated from his native China to Brazil. And then the legacy of, that I won't give too much away, but, that's an interesting story. My own relatives. So I have, typical, I'm from Scranton, Pennsylvania, very famously a working class town and the, birthplace of our current president.
Right.
Yeah. And home of the office. Right. And it's just not this well-known kind of area for being a bastion of prestigious jobs, and yet I come from Italian American immigrant coal miners and farmers, and to where I am. And I think Christopher and I both feel that we know those origins and remember those roots and want to honor them. And then when it comes to our, differences of, so we watch the adults around us having various relationships to their work. And I think that planted the seeds of inquiry for us both that, wow, work takes up a big part of people's lives, of their identities, of just the time and energy that they spend. Work's a big deal, and we want to better understand that. And then I think for our discipline, so I like to joke, I like to tell this story about Christopher inviting me to a panel at the Society for Business Ethics. It was on really juicy topics, meaningful work in the fourth industrial revolution, like what will happen with AI, what will work mean, and where will work go? And in the chat, on the side, I see the philosophers debating the entire time, what do we mean when we say work? Like they can't even get to the next thing. What do we mean by work?
Yep.
And as an organizational psychologist, I'm like, let's define it. Let's operationalize it. Let's create a scale to measure it. So, we have these natural just differences before working together. Christopher, like many philosophers, had never worked with data, whereas I've taken extensive classes on research methods, statistics, analysis, inference, all these things that he had to learn to be an empiricist. So we see our disciplinary differences as being our greatest strengths. As a co-author team, we wish more people had not just interdisciplinary, but maybe radically interdisciplinary co-authorships, because we see how fruitful it is. So we'd love to encourage that. But we do get in moments where I will say, well, what matters most is what's in the person's head. What do they think? Christopher will say, just to push back, I think we can agree. There are some things that we should do, right? There's a normative perspective on what is best for society, or what should we do? Obvious example there, if everyone thought about what they, were most, if their passion or their, desire to do something, that they felt was meaningful work was most important, and we didn't care about societal benefits, we would have things like terrorists, right? That we held up as it's a deep passion, it's a willingness to sacrifice everything, and then it's really societally, counterproductive. So whereas, we can have those kinds of debates because we come from such distinct perspectives. But again, I think at the core of it is and it's why the book, as has been observed by people who did early reviews of it, like many philosophers, Christopher and we, ask a lot of questions, and we don't pretend to provide easy answers. This is not an easy topic about what work means to people or how work fits in life. And so, although psychologists sometimes want to help people get to an answer, I'd like to say we're trying to help people get to their own answer rather than trying to dictate something more top down or more one size fits all.
Right. So what does the philosopher say, Christopher?
Yeah, I will add that, like most author teams, I imagine, we don't agree on everything, but one of the things that we agree on is that psychology brings a perspective of how people are, and philosophy purports to bring a perspective of how we ought to be. And that's what the book is about. Who are we, and who do we wish to be? Who do we aspire to be through our work? Jen is right. I hadn't worked with data before we were an author team. In fact, I had the idea of doing the study on the portraits of grief just sitting in my back pocket for years, thinking, I've got to figure out how to do this.
Right.
And then one day, Jen and I were at a conference having a conversation about this idea, and she was really interested in it. And I realized this is how it gets done, by somebody who has the skill to analyze the data combined with my perspective. And we need each other as co-authors. It's funny, I'm thinking about this as we are on screen together. When we started writing this book, Jen was in a conference room with our agent, I think in their last meeting before the COVID shutdown, and I was on Zoom.
Yep.
And throughout the 4-year process of writing the proposal, writing the book, and then waiting for the book to come out, we might have seen each other a couple of times.
Right.
But we work really smoothly with each other. And as Jen likes to say, sometimes I will set the ball and she will spike the ball, using a volleyball analogy, because I'm usually the one who's itching to, let's just get it done. Let's get it started. And her kids are younger than mine, and she doesn't have as much flexibility as I do. And so that's how we work as a team.
I thank you for sharing that from both of you, because I really think it's important for listeners and people who are interested in the book to really appreciate just how multidimensional this book is, but also how multifaceted the read is. Like, the read is so pleasurable because you have so many different perspectives and different references coming into it. So I really enjoyed that. And so let's get into some of the big topics. And the first one I'm going to just kind of throw out there, and we have talked a little bit about it. When you ask the question on the cover, is your work worth it? You're using worth on multiple levels, as we've just talked about. Worth is about value. It's about getting paid fairly for the work we do. It's about what it means to us and what we give up in other areas of our lives. How did you manage to define perhaps first, and then wrangle all of those definitions, and which of course also is dependent on the person doing the work and feeling how they feel about it. How did you undergo this topic?
Well, as I answer that, first I want to say, I think, Sally, you might be our favorite reader, because you seem to understand the book so well and to ask such good questions about it. And I'm not sure that we have totally figured it out, which is part of the reason that the title of the book is a question, and every chapter title is a question. And I think one thing that makes this book maybe a little bit different from other books about contemplating one's career and one's place in life is that we live, I think, in a time when everybody is searching for easy answers, but we know those easy answers are usually pretty unsatisfying because we're asking really hard questions. So when I say I don't know if we've totally figured it out, that's not false modesty. It really is because these are difficult questions. And as you say, the answers are probably different for each person.
Mhm.
But there are some universals in the questions themselves and in the way that we think about worth and value. So, as you suggested, one way in which, and maybe the first way in which we often think about the value of something is we think of it in terms of its monetary value.
Mhm.
And I think part of the reason for that, especially as it relates to work, is that we sometimes work, in fact, most of the time, work to make a living. And so we need to know the number and we need to know whether we can live on that
Mhm.
number. And because we are so focused on that number, even if we know that it's enough to live on, we also want to know what somebody else is making and what we'll make when we get the next promotion, because that sort of value becomes meaningful in a way that goes
Mhm.
beyond mere dollars. It actually suggests status in the organization, in society, prestige, and so on. And because it's a number, I think we tend to fixate a little bit more
Mhm.
on that because it's measurable. Whereas other forms of value, like how good it makes me feel or what contribution it makes to society, those aren't monetizable. And because they're not, they tend to fall into the background, maybe when we're having
Mhm.
concrete conversations about value. And I guess one thing that we're trying to do is to make sure that those kinds of value to self, value to society, alongside value in monetary terms,
Mhm.
are in the foreground of our consideration. Because one thing that we learned not only from 9/11 victims, but also, as you said, from pop culture, songs by Dire Straits and David Bowie, and from literature, including stories by Guy de Maupassant, we learn that in the end, what we are remembered for really isn't the monetary value we made.
Mhm.
It is those other things, family, love, generosity, etc., the contributions that we make to our communities and to our societies that we all know really matter in the long run. And yet we fixate so often on those measurable things in the short run.
Mhm. I would add perhaps also that this is not like an anti-work book, right? Like that's one of the we do see a lot of that, right? Like, walk out the door of your office. You know, your work will give you nothing kind of thing. When in actuality, it's about I guess the right fit. I hesitate to say the balance because it's often this work-life balance is often contested, and it means different things to different people, and you can put a lot of time into something for a short amount of time versus less amount into less effort into a longer amount of time. All of that, but how would you define how this book and your questions about work treat work as a part of a person's life?
So we wrote the book. What we like to say is that sort of post 2000, post 9/11, I think about that famous/infamous Steve Jobs Stanford commencement
Uh-huh.
speech, where he basically told everyone the only way to do good work is to love what you do. We quote this, I'm paraphrasing, but we quote this in the book. And if you haven't found it yet, keep searching, keep looking. And we had this moment of sort of what I'll call peak calling, or this do
Mhm.
what you love, that work has to be what you love. It has to be inseparable from your life. And that is not only a mandate for good work, doing good work. Again, Jobs said the only way to do good work, but to have a fulfilling life. And so we had all these books that were some version of do what you love, the money will follow, find your calling, love your life, etc. And it was just this enormous pressure. And then we would see students come in buckling under this pressure. I'm 20 years old, 19, 20. I haven't figured it out yet. Basically, like, is my life, can I still have a good life?
Yeah.
Can I still have a good life? And we just thought this is too far this way. Then I think the cultural conversation, as you just alluded to, swung to the other end. So then we have basically, if you love your work, you're a sucker. It's a capitalist exploitation. And, certainly we discuss in the book the potential for, and this is some of my own research is on this. When you love your work, you open yourself up to the potential for exploitation, of course, right? So we would, we want to kind of recognize both sides and hold both sides in tension, but we really see ourselves as in the middle. We are not one extreme or the other, but we're trying to provide a much more, and here I'm going to use that word again, balanced view of what realistically work can hold in terms of meaning for life. Because the reality is you can do great work even if you don't love it. We know that, right? Loving your work is not a panacea. It is not a surefire guarantee. And there are no, I think that the end of the day, there is no one size fits all to what work means. There's no one size fits all. Again, we have this myth, and it has a lot of staying power, that if work is your calling, you know it from birth. You're basically the kid who was, painting only in your spare time, and therefore you're destined to be an artist, ... And therefore you're destined to be successful. We know that, narrative is not true for so many people, even those who could identify a quote unquote calling. Then lots of people stumble into work. I would say myself, my own narrative is one of this. I stumbled into this work. I would never have said I would be doing this. I love it more than anything. I can't imagine doing anything else. As a result, do I get great joy from it? Does it contribute to my life? Do I feel that I do decent work as a result of it? Yes. Are there times when I push myself way too hard and don't have a boundary and find myself responding to my co-author with older kids and much more of a life, his, late night emails about the book, or about something that we're co-authoring together? Absolutely. I make sacrifices because I love the work so much. So I think we tried to acknowledge those two extremes of the cultural conversation. I think the correction for the do what you love as a surefire, I'm glad that we had a course correction, but I think then the pendulum kind of swung a little bit too far the other way, because if you love what you do, you're also not a chump of, being taken advantage of by corporate overlords by definition.
Right.
We believe that people should not feel as a given that their work is drudgery, that it is meaningless, and that it contributes nothing to their life. But there's got to be some, it's not an all or nothing, and there's got to be some in between.
I'm going to pivot a little bit here. And one of you mentioned this in an early back and forth. Can we talk a little bit about privilege? Right. And how much you pay a lot of attention in the book to the question of whether choice, when it comes to work, following a calling, having a purpose, being able to, cut back on your work hours, being able to style your work after the rest of the demands in your life, whether that is a privilege and open to some and not for all. And I think you do such a good job of acknowledging that the conversation is often about the people who can make those choices. And I think one of the dangers, as you were just saying about previous conversations about work, is that if you're not making those choices, somehow either your life is less or your work is less worthy, but your lack of independence and your lack of risk-taking and things like that are somehow your fault. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about privilege, how this book and the questions that we ask are not meant for only one category of worker, but actually meant for everyone.
Sally, there's no question that it is a luxury in some way to be able to ask this question, but also to believe that you have a choice in what the answer will be, to have some kind of control over the outcome of your inquiry. But we also think that this is a question, is your work worth it, that anybody asks during the course of a difficult day or during the course of an entire career, whether or not they have a choice in the matter of changing it. You're also right that we sometimes give greater status to those who do find work that they love. Interestingly enough, though, I think some of the most interesting stories in the book, and as you said, we not only mined our own research, but also literature and pop culture, but we also conducted a series of interviews for the book, and we tell the stories of many of those interviewees. I think some of the most interesting stories are not of people who see their work as a calling, but who see their work as a job. So, for example, there's one person who we interviewed who is a retired military veteran, gets some disability pay, but he also makes ends meet as a part-time street sweeper and gig worker, renting out cars on an app. And he has a fascinating philosophy of work that most of us work to seek stability in our lives. And to him, stability equates to boredom. We also talk about Tolstoy's book, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And Tolstoy has this wonderful line in there that Ivan Ilyich's life was the most simple and ordinary and therefore most terrible. And I think that sentiment is what Robert, the guy I was talking about, was essentially conveying to us, that he didn't want a simple and ordinary life. He wanted a life of adventure. And so for him, work is very much a means to the end of his dream of driving the school bus, the converted school bus that he lives on, down to a beach and pursuing a life of adventure. And even if that's not for many of us, and even if that probably sounds a bit like a luxury, he's working hard in order to make this dream happen. And I think his perspective on what makes work worth doing certainly deserves consideration among anybody who just sort of settles into a life of stability. I think another important point to make about privilege is that those of us who may be lucky enough to have the privilege to shape the meaningfulness of our own work probably are in a position to shape the meaning of other people's work as well. So Jen and I, as professors, we may not supervise employees, but we teach a lot of students. And we feel like if we teach them to seek work that's worth doing, hopefully not only will they do it, but they will also seek it for others that they may lead someday. And we've all worked for superiors who don't really care about having any purpose or potential in their work. And that attitude sort of bleeds into the work of their subordinates and makes it worse for everybody. So we hope that in one way, this book will influence those who read it to influence others' work in a positive way.
I think the next natural pathway to take here is to talk about money, right? And you write We work perhaps most often because we can't afford not to work. And then you also note that this is more complicated than it first appears because there's an endless variety, quote, there's an endless variety of worthwhile values motivating working for money that are about more than money. And I've sort of meditated on that because I really think it is something that we don't naturally do. We tend to label things or people as they just want more money, or they are greedy, or they care more about their position than people, or whatever the label is. But what you're saying is that money serves, I guess this may not be the way you'd say it, but to fund a life and to fund the things that are very meaningful for you, and thus that money has meaning in that way. So how would you guys say that better than I did? But also how we can understand that, like, working for money isn't selling out. And in many of the stories that you include, it's about making an agreement for yourself between making the money and doing the things that you enjoy, if for whatever reason how you make the money is not doing the things that you enjoy.
Okay, I'm going to start by backing up to the 9/11 victims and the portraits of grief. That's where I'm going to start, because 2/3 of the portraits that we analyzed did not actually go into work as even enough detail that we could figure out what work meant in that life. So it was basically they worked as a equities trader at Cantor Fitzgerald, period. Nothing more. The rest of the portrait was about what they did outside of work. They loved music. They loved their family. They were devoted to their dogs, something. So that was 2/3 of those victims where we didn't have and that's not a proxy to say their work meant nothing to them, or their work, their pursuits outside of work meant more. But as they were remembered, it was less about definitely work playing a central role in life, and a lot more about what outside of work added to that legacy, made their lives worth living. So the idea that work enables something, of value outside is natural. And so that therefore the money that we make can be used outside is natural. Then I'm going to sort of fast forward to right now, this exact present moment, where Christopher and I are both sitting in our offices on college campuses as just outside our windows, people are getting ready to graduate. So I have, people outside my office literally right now, I saw them earlier, taking photos with their families in their graduation caps and gowns. And we've thought a lot. I mean, our book is, we would love college graduates to read our book. We would love it to be valuable for them, sort of setting out, first jobs for many of them in the real world. And we'd love to give them some sense of what to expect. And the reality for a lot of them is they are graduating with an economic landscape that may seem to be stacked against them. College debt, housing that's out of reach. I live in the suburbs of Boston, and it is, we thought, how much worse can it get? And then the pandemic hits, and oh my gosh, it's gotten worse. And like I said, Christopher and I both spent our formative, early years of our careers in New York City, famously expensive city. So, how do you not think about the economic value of work and how much money you're making when you have loans to pay back and you have maybe dreams of establishing yourself, owning a home, supporting a family, et cetera, whatever those life goals are. So it's not wrong. I mean, we would never want to give people the idea that it's somehow wrong or less noble or less understandable to think about money as a reward for work, or even to try to maximize money as a reward for work. There's, of course, a limit, right? If you already have a lot and you're just trying to sort of get more as a, as a game, right? Or as a just way to advance endlessly. That's a different story. But we know that's not the economic reality for a lot of people. At the same time, often we ask people to trade off between money and what we'll say meaning or purpose. So in society, it's no surprise we often pay the jobs that do the most good the least. We ask people to take basically a salary penalty for doing meaningful work. And there's fascinating studies, not by us, but by others, coming out about just how embedded this notion is that people who were participants in an experiment that was pinpointing this exact thing felt it was fair and appropriate to pay people less who love the work, because the love should substitute for the money. And again, back to this earlier point about exploitation and, at what point are we asking people whether we have this even, phrase, starving artists or nonprofit workers or healthcare workers, teachers. I mean, think about also some of the dependencies on certain roles in society that the COVID pandemic laid bare. Often these jobs that we considered so essential ended up, it's hard not to recognize that these are not often the most well-compensated jobs. So just this, if we're asking people to potentially make this trade-off, I mean, of course it would be great if we could maximize both. We could do deeply meaningful work that does good in society, that pays us enough to pay off our student loans. But the reality is often we trade those off. And so sort of being intentional about what I need now and what I'm prioritizing now and why is sort of what we wanted to get people to think about.
I think that's what's interesting is that question of how do we know now, right? You discuss quite a bit about how, let's say, graduates leave school with a plan. And let's say we are in a time of opportunity when they can, buckle down, work hard for 20 years, plan to retire, plan to make $1 million, plan to do their art after they've made the money, after they've had their kids. And we do a lot of planning for the future, which in the book, there are a number of different ways that is dangerous or at least unreliable. And one of them being, we can't know the future, of course. And one of them being, we don't know how we will feel in the future. Like we think we know when we're 20 what we're going to feel like when we're 40, and we really have no idea what that is. Can you talk a little bit about how this book is going to prompt people to use the present moment to make some changes or just reflect on where they're at? Something like burnout can inform you about what you need to do in the moment, but maybe you're in a good spot, but you want to be somewhere in the future. Like, how do we navigate that when we're being conscious of our relationship to work?
I think you just used a really important word, Sally, which is conscious. A lot of the time we just sort of sleepwalk through our working lives. We just let things happen and we start to coast. We get into a groove. We get good at one thing, and that becomes our brand. It becomes our destiny in a way. And we hope by reading this book and considering the stories within it, it just leads people to choose consciously. And, you alluded to the fact that our tastes and opportunities change over time. I think one of the great tragedies of 9/11 was that so many people, every life lost was a tragedy, of course, but the average age of the victims was in their mid to late 30s. And so many people were at that stage that you just described, where they were maybe working really, really hard for the next couple of decades so that they could enjoy a life of leisure later that never came.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't take a tragedy to teach that to us, because I think instinctively we all know that life is short and precious. But a tragedy like 9/11 or a tragedy like the COVID-19 pandemic can be a reset point for us to really reflect on what it's all for. And as Studs Terkel famously said in his 1972 book Working, the subtitle of that book was What People All Do All Day and How They Feel About What They Do All Day. That's a reminder that this is how we spend such a large share of our waking adult hours, that we should be thinking consciously about not just how we feel about it, but why ultimately we do it. And as Jen suggested, with the monetary pressures, it might not be possible in a first job out of college to have all the meaning and money that you desire. It may not be possible in your 10th job out of college, but it might be possible if you continue to come up for air and sort of think consciously about where am I and what's next. It might be possible over the course of time to sort of put together a portfolio of work throughout one's career, in which sometimes money takes priority over meaning, sometimes meaning takes priority over money, sometimes we're lucky enough to have them both simultaneously. But over that course, maybe we find a worthwhile working life. I think one other piece of advice, particularly maybe aimed at those who are seeking their first job out of college, would be to not focus on the number again, on the amount of money that I need in order to live the lifestyle that I aspire to live. Because if we do that, if we set sort of a minimum salary for ourselves in order to live the life that we've imagined, then we might rule out half or more of all possible careers because money matters so much. Maybe we should choose the work that seems most worthwhile in a conscious way, and then figure out what kind of lifestyle would that allow instead of the other way around.
You touch on this a little bit throughout the book, and I wouldn't say that there's a lot of presence with the word happiness, but it's definitely can money buy happiness, and what power does money have in actually making, and obviously I just need to say that we're obviously talking beyond our needs, right? When we're talking about rent and we're talking about healthcare and we're talking about childcare, money is essential, and happiness declines if we can't afford these essentials for us. But when we talk about, I think I'm going to read this from the book, quote, "To confuse wealth with worth is to conflate pleasure with happiness. When we contend that money can't buy happiness, what we are really saying is that the kind of pleasure that money can buy is not the kind of happiness to which we ought to aspire," which I think jumps off what you just said, Christopher, about when we limit ourselves to just, if I buy that car that will make me happy, which it probably will. You'll probably be really happy you bought a new car, whether you needed one or you just needed an upgrade, but you'll probably be happy for a while. But it limits the availability of other types of happiness. Is that sort of an accurate way of reflecting that?
Yeah, absolutely. We're notoriously very bad at predicting how happy we will be. We keep thinking, we tell ourselves, if only I had, right, this next promotion or enough to buy this or that, or we do social comparisons. So I had what my neighbor has, right, that then we'll be happy. And that's very rarely the case. We typically have kind of a happiness, set point that we more or less, and again, accepting extreme circumstances, but, we can't necessarily bump ourselves up, significantly based on this one thing that we're aspiring to do. And I think where we really see this is this kind of willingness to trade off our present day lives for a future that is not guaranteed and sort of may never come. So you have people, gosh, our students say it all the time. We talk about, one of Christopher's students in the book, I'm going to just, my students like to say, grind it out. I'm just going to grind in my 20s, retire at age 30 and kick back. And then I'm really going to live my real life. Like that's when real life starts, and, there's so many things about that, right, that we could push back on. What is that magical number that will allow you to retire at 30? How do you know it's 30? What if you don't have that much? Then what will you do with your abundant free time? Will you miss working? Will you, but we sort of keep telling ourselves some version of we're going to kind of suck it up now, but it's an investment in the future. And so we just want, again, people to think much more intentionally and in the present moment. Every moment I have is a choice and is a chance to do something that is maybe not what is, culturally prescribed, maybe not what I see everyone around me doing. For our students, it's often maybe not what my parents want or what my expectations are. But, what is really what I need to be doing now and why? That's for us, that's really where we want people to think about.
So I'm aghast that we are approaching 4 o'clock. And I feel like we need a part 2 so we can talk about obligation, philanthropy, what it looks like to not work, what value we put on people who choose not to work or people who retire or who are unable to work, not by choice, legacy, capitalism, all of this stuff. All of this stuff is in this book, and that is why everybody needs to read it. Do either of you have any before I do my little conclusion, do either of you have anything you'd just like to add before we go?
I will very briefly echo Christopher's, you are our dream reader, Sally. Thank you. Just to feel like someone really gets and appreciates the book means the world to authors, especially first-time authors like ourselves. Half the time you're saying, will anybody read it? Will anybody care? So this means the world. So just a very sincere thank you. And I'll turn it over to Christopher.
Thank you for writing it.
And thank you from me too. And I will just add to the long list of topics and ways of thinking about work that you mentioned that there is work that is done inside the home that is not considered by tax authorities to be work. And sometimes that can be the most important work that we often forget about. And
I'm so glad you said that.
Even that definition of what work is an important part of this whole consideration.
And I think to get closer to understanding what work means to each of us, you'll find that in these questions and prompts in the book, and all of the considerations for you Hamilton fans. You're gonna get a lot of joy out of some of those references. And if this conversation alone hasn't convinced you to buy a copy of Christopher and Jen's excellent book, perhaps this from page 175 will do the trick. We can work effectively and indeterminately without contemplating whether our work is meaningful and why it matters. But if we don't reflect on its meaning, then we may be left with a lifetime of regret about who we did or did not work for, the work we did or did not do, working too much or too little, or doing work that seems less than essential in retrospect. So if we don't want to find ourselves there, whether it's now or in the future, engage with this book and learn more about yourself and your relationship to work. Thank you so much, Jen and Christopher. Yay!
Thank you.